They called her a whore, a demon, and the most dangerous woman in the Byzantine Empire. But what they didn't know was that every humiliation, every horror she endured in her early life would transform her into the most powerful empress in history, capable of bringing grown men to their knees with a single glance. Most people think they know the story of Empress Theodora. They've heard she was a former actress who married Emperor Justinian and helped rule the Byzantine Empire. But that sanitized version barely scratches the surface of one of history's most incredible transformations. What you're about to discover is the real story of how a girl from the absolute bottom of Byzantine society survived unthinkable sexual exploitation, systematic abuse, and social humiliation to become so powerful that she could literally change the fate of empires with her decisions. This isn't just another boring history lesson about some ancient queen. This is the story of survival, revenge, and the kind of political genius that modern leaders can only dream of having. By the end of this video, you'll understand why Theodora's enemies feared her more than death itself, and why her rise to power remains one of the most shocking stories in all of human history. Picture Constantinople in the year 500 AD. The morning sun rises over the Bosphorus, painting the waters gold as it illuminates the greatest city on earth. The massive walls of Constantinople stretch for miles, protecting nearly 500,000 souls packed into an urban maze that defied comprehension. This was New Rome, the beating heart of an empire that stretched from the Danube to the deserts of Egypt, from the mountains of Armenia to the shores of Spain. But step closer to this golden city, past the marble palaces and soaring churches, and you'd discover that Constantinople was also a city built on human misery. The sweet smell of incense from 1,000 churches mixed with the stench of open sewers. The sound of hymns rising from the Hagia Sophia competed with screams echoing from the torture chambers beneath the imperial palace. In the shadow of the great Hippodrome, where 100,000 spectators could gather to watch chariot races that determined the fate of emperors, lay a maze of narrow streets filled with taverns, brothels, and tenement buildings that housed the city's forgotten masses. Here, in buildings so poorly constructed that they collapsed regularly, crushing their inhabitants like insects, lived the people who made Constantinople's glory possible. The dock workers, the street sweepers, the prostitutes, the actors, and the animal keepers who provided entertainment for the masses. This was the world into which Theodora was born around 497 AD, in a single room that housed her entire family. Her father, Acacius, worked as a bearkeeper for the Green Faction, one of the two massive political organizations that dominated Constantinople's social and political life. These weren't just sports clubs. The Blues and the Greens were quasi-military organizations that could field armies of supporters, influence imperial policy, and literally determine who lived or died in the capital of the Roman Empire. The room where Theodora spent her earliest years measured perhaps 10 feet by 12 feet. It had no windows, just a small opening near the ceiling that let in a thin stream of light during the day and the sounds of the city at all hours. The walls were made of crumbling brick, patched with mud and straw. The floor was hard-packed earth that turned to mud when it rained, which was often. In this single room lived Theodora, her parents, and her two sisters. They slept on straw mattresses that were infested with rats and fleas. They cooked their meager meals over a small charcoal brazier that filled the room with smoke and made breathing difficult. When winter came, they huddled together for warmth, wearing every piece of clothing they owned and still shivering through the night. But for young Theodora, this wasn't poverty. This was simply life. She had nothing to compare it to except the lives of other families in nearby rooms who lived in identical conditions. She played in alleyways that reeked of human waste and rotting garbage. She watched as neighbors died of diseases that had no names. their bodies carried away by municipal workers who dumped them in mass graves outside the city walls. Yet even in this environment, something in Theodora was different. While her sisters accepted their circumstances with the resignation that poverty teaches, Theodora watched everything with hungry eyes that missed nothing. She studied the way power worked in her small world, noting who gave orders and who followed them, who had enough food and who went hungry, who was protected and who was vulnerable. She observed that her father, despite his lowly position, commanded respect from other Green supporters because of his connection to the faction. She saw that information was currency in her neighborhood, that knowing who was sleeping with whom, who owed money to dangerous people, who was planning to betray whom, could be traded for food, protection, or favor. Most importantly, she learned that in a world where everyone was expendable, survival depended on making yourself useful to people with power. When Theodora was perhaps 5 years old, during one of Constantinople's brutal winters when ice formed in the Bosphorus and people froze to death in the streets, her father Acacius collapsed while feeding the bears in the Hippodrome. He had been working despite a fever that had racked his body for days, because missing work meant no pay, and no pay meant his family would starve. Theodora would later remember the moment her mother received the news. A fellow bearkeeper came to their door, still covered in sawdust from the arena, his face grim with the weight of the message he carried. He spoke quietly to her mother, but in their tiny room, there were no secrets. Acacius had died instantly when his heart gave out. The bears, confused and agitated by the scent of death, had to be driven back with whips and torches. The man left without offering any help, because in Constantinople's brutal economy, sympathy was a luxury nobody could afford. Theodora's mother, whose name history has forgotten, sat in their dark room, holding her youngest daughter, while Theodora and her middle sister pressed against the wall, understanding instinctively that their world had just ended. In the Byzantine Empire, a widow with children and no other family faced a simple choice: find another man to support her immediately, or watch her children die slowly from starvation. There was no social safety net, no charitable organizations powerful enough to make a difference, no government assistance for the poor. The city's wealthy funded hospitals for the sick and hostels for travelers. But these institutions had no resources for healthy people who simply couldn't find work. Within days of Acacius's death, creditors began appearing at their door. Their room was rented, not owned, and the landlord wanted his money. The neighborhood shops where the family had purchased food on credit wanted their debts settled. Even the children who had played with Theodora in the streets began avoiding her, as if poverty were a disease that could spread through contact. Theodora's mother, desperate and running out of time, began searching for another man willing to marry a woman with 3 young daughters. This wasn't romance. This was a business transaction where the stakes were life and death. She needed someone who could take over Acacius's position as a bearkeeper, because that job came with a small but steady income, and more importantly, a place in the Green faction's social hierarchy. She found him within 2 weeks. His name was lost to history, but he was older than Acacius had been, widowed himself, and willing to take on a ready-made family in exchange for a wife to cook his meals and share his bed. Theodora would always remember him as a man who smelled of cheap wine and unwashed clothing, who looked at her and her sisters with eyes that held no warmth, only calculation. The marriage was arranged quickly and celebrated not at all. One day, Theodora's mother was a widow begging for help, and the next day, she was married to a man who promised to save them all. But salvation in Constantinople always came with a price. The new stepfather moved into their tiny room, making the space even more cramped and uncomfortable. But more importantly, he faced the crucial test that would determine the family's future. Could he secure Acacius's old job with the Green faction? This is where young Theodora received her first lesson in how power really worked in the Byzantine world. her stepfather presented himself to the Green faction leadership, explained his marriage to Acacius's widow, and requested that he be given the position of bearkeeper that had become vacant. The Greens' response was swift and brutal. They had already given the job to someone else, a man whose family had served the faction for generations. Theodora's stepfather, despite his marriage and his willingness to work, was nobody to them. He had no connections, no history of service, no political value. His request was denied without discussion. Theodora's mother, facing the reality that her desperate gamble had failed, made a decision that would haunt her daughter for the rest of her life. She would take her 3 girls to the Hippodrome during the next major race day and publicly beg for mercy from the Green faction in front of the entire crowd. This wasn't just humiliation. This was social suicide. Once you had publicly begged for charity, you were marked forever as someone who couldn't survive on your own merits. You became one of Constantinople's thousands of professional beggars, existing on scraps and charity, never again able to claim dignity or respect. But Theodora's mother had no choice. Her family was days away from being thrown out of their room. Her daughters were already showing signs of malnutrition. They had sold everything they owned that had any value, down to the last cooking pot and the worn blankets that had been their only protection against the cold. The day she chose was one of Constantinople's grandest racing spectacles. The emperor himself was present, seated in the kathisma, the imperial box that connected directly to the palace. Below him, arranged in strict hierarchical order, sat the city's elite, senators in their purple-striped togas, wealthy merchants displaying their gold jewelry, military officers wearing their decorations, and the leaders of the blue and green factions occupying their traditional seats. Theodora would remember every detail of that day for the rest of her life. The overwhelming noise of 100,000 people packed into the Hippodrome's stone seats. The smell of roasted meat and wine mixing with human sweat, and the dust kicked up by the racing chariots. The brilliant colors of the racing silks and the faction banners fluttering in the wind. Her mother dressed the 3 girls in flower garlands, the traditional costume of supplicants seeking charity. These weren't fresh flowers, but wilted blossoms gathered from the garbage behind temples and churches. The garlands made them look like sacrificial victims, which, in a sense, they were. As the crowd settled in for the races, Theodora's mother led her daughters down to the track level and approached the Green faction's seating area. The section fell silent as spectators realized what was happening. This wasn't unusual entertainment. Public begging was common enough in Constantinople that most people barely noticed it, but the Green faction leadership noticed. These were the same men who had denied her stepfather employment. And now, here was Acacius's widow, making them look heartless in front of thousands of witnesses. One of the Green leaders stood up and shouted something that made the crowd roar with laughter. Theodora was too young to understand all the words, but she understood the tone, the cruelty, the complete dismissal of their desperate situation. Her mother, humiliated but not yet defeated, walked her daughters across the track to the blue faction's seating area. This was an enormous risk. Approaching the rival faction was tantamount to declaring that you had abandoned your original loyalty, a betrayal that could have violent consequences in Constantinople's factional politics. But the Blues, perhaps sensing an opportunity to embarrass their rivals, perhaps genuinely moved by the sight of 3 young girls in flower garlands, perhaps simply calculating the political benefit of appearing generous, made a great show of their charity. The Blue leader stood up and announced that not only would they give employment to the girl's stepfather, but they would do so at a higher wage than the Greens had been paying Acacius. The Blue section erupted in cheers, celebrating their faction's superior generosity, while the Greens sat in embarrassed silence. For Theodora, watching from the dusty floor of the Hippodrome while 100,000 people cheered or jeered above her, This moment crystallized everything she would need to understand about survival in the Byzantine world. Power wasn't about justice or merit. It was about who could help you and what you could offer in return. Loyalty was a commodity that could be bought, sold, and transferred based on whoever offered the better deal. And public humiliation, while painful, could sometimes be transformed into political victory if you understood how to use it. From that day forward, Theodora was a blue. But more importantly, she had learned that survival meant understanding how power worked, who had it, and how to manipulate those systems to get what you needed. She had also learned that sometimes you had to be willing to sacrifice your dignity to save your life, but that if you were clever enough, you might be able to get both back eventually. The employment with the Blue faction saved Theodora's family from immediate starvation, but it also introduced her to aspects of Constantinople's entertainment industry that would shape her understanding of power, sexuality, and survival in ways that most people could never imagine. The Hippodrome wasn't just a racing venue. It was the center of Constantinople's entire entertainment complex, a sprawling network of theaters, brothels, taverns, and gambling houses that operated in the shadows of the great arena. Her stepfather's job as a bearkeeper meant that the family lived in this world, and as Theodora grew from a child into a young woman, she observed everything with the same hungry attention that had marked her even as a small girl. By the time she was 10 years old, Theodora could navigate the complex social hierarchies of Constantinople's entertainment district with the skill of a diplomat. She knew which theater owners were honest and which would cheat their performers out of wages. She could identify undercover imperial agents who were monitoring the crowds for signs of sedition or unrest. She understood which Green faction members were secretly negotiating with Blues, which merchants were selling watered wine, and which prostitutes were actually imperial spies gathering intelligence on their clients. This wasn't just street-smart knowledge. Theodora was developing a sophisticated understanding of how information flowed through Constantinople's power structures. She learned that secrets were the most valuable currency in the empire, that the right piece of information delivered to the right person at the right time could be worth more than gold. She also learned that women in her social class had very limited options for survival. The daughters of bearkeepers, actors, and other entertainment workers typically followed one of three paths. They married men from similar backgrounds and spent their lives in poverty. They joined the entertainment industry themselves as actresses and prostitutes, or they died young from disease, violence, or starvation. None of these options appealed to Theodora. Even as a child, she had glimpsed wealth and power when imperial officials visited the Hippodrome, when wealthy merchants brought their families to the races, when senators and generals appeared in their boxes wearing silk and gold. She had seen that there was another world beyond the tenements and taverns, and she was determined to find a way into it. Her opportunity came when she was around 12 years old. The theater manager who controlled most of the entertainment venues near the Hippodrome noticed that Theodora had grown into an exceptionally beautiful girl. But more importantly, that she was intelligent, quick-witted, and unintimidated by the rough environment of Constantinople's entertainment district. He approached her stepfather with a proposal. He would hire Theodora as an assistant to the actresses in his theater troupe. She would help with costumes, makeup, and props, and she would learn the entertainment business from the inside. The pay would be better than anything her family could hope for otherwise, and if she showed talent, she might eventually become a performer herself. Her stepfather, who had never shown much interest in his stepdaughter's futures, saw only the immediate financial benefit. Her mother, who understood better what this decision might mean for her daughter's life, had no power to refuse. In the Byzantine Empire, women and children were legal property of their male relatives, and stepfathers had the same rights as biological fathers when it came to making decisions about their daughters' lives. So, at 12 years old, Theodora entered the world of Byzantine theater, not understanding that she was crossing a line from which there would be no return. In Constantinople's rigid social hierarchy, women who worked in the entertainment industry were permanently marked as degraded, legally prohibited from marrying into respectable families, and essentially excluded from any possibility of social mobility. But Theodora didn't know this yet. All she knew was that she was finally getting a chance to escape the tenement room where her family lived, to earn her own money, and to learn skills that might give her some control over her own destiny. She had no idea that she was walking directly into a world where women were viewed not as human beings with rights and dignity, but as objects to be used for other people's entertainment and pleasure. Constantinople's theaters in the early 6th century were nothing like the refined dramatic venues that had existed in classical Greece and Rome. These were crude, violent entertainment halls where anything went as long as it drew crowds and generated revenue. The performances combined elements that we would today recognize as strip shows, pornographic films, violent spectacles, and crude comedy routines, all mixed together in productions that were designed to shock, titillate, and provide outlets for the crowd's basest instincts. Theodora's first job was officially as a costume assistant, but she quickly learned that everyone who worked in the theater was expected to be available for whatever tasks the management required. She helped actresses into costumes that consisted mainly of thin, transparent fabric that revealed more than it concealed. She applied makeup that was designed to make the performers look like exotic sexual fantasies rather than real women. She arranged props that were often crude representations of sexual organs or torture devices used in the more violent performances. The theater where she worked was located in one of the narrow streets that connected the Hippodrome to the harbor district. The building itself was a converted warehouse, with a small stage at one end and rough wooden benches for the audience. There were no separate dressing rooms for the performers. Everyone changed costumes in full view of anyone who happened to be backstage, which often included wealthy patrons who paid extra for the privilege of watching the actresses prepare for their performances. The audiences were drawn from every level of Constantinople society except the highest aristocracy. Merchants, soldiers, government clerks, skilled craftsmen, and foreign visitors packed the theater every night, drinking heavily and shouting comments that ranged from appreciative to abusive. The atmosphere was charged with sexual tension, alcohol-fueled aggression, and the kind of mob mentality that could turn violent without warning. Theodora watched it all with the same analytical attention she had brought to every other environment in her life. She studied the way different actresses handled difficult audience members, noting which strategies worked and which ones led to trouble. She observed how the theater owners manipulated the crowd's emotions, building excitement for the most popular performers while using less experienced actresses to warm up the audience. Most importantly, she learned that success in this environment depended not just on physical attractiveness, but on understanding psychology. The actresses who lasted longest and earned the most money were those who could read their audience's desires and fears, who could make individual men in the crowd feel like they had a personal connection with the performer, and who could navigate the dangerous line between being sexually available and maintaining enough dignity to command respect. After 6 months of working behind the scenes, the theater manager told Theodora that she was ready to begin performing. This wasn't a question or a request. It was simply an economic decision. She had learned the business. She was old enough to attract customers, and she represented an investment that needed to start generating returns. Her first performance was in what was called a mime show, which had nothing to do with silent performance and everything to do with explicit sexual theater. She was paired with 2 older actresses in a skit that involved a supposed religious ceremony that turned into an orgy. Theodora's role was relatively minor, but it required her to appear nearly naked on stage and simulate sexual acts with her fellow performers. Standing on that stage for the first time, with hundreds of men shouting crude comments and sexual propositions, Theodora experienced something that would define the rest of her life. Instead of feeling shame or humiliation, she felt power. These men, many of whom held respected positions in Constantinople society, were completely captivated by her presence. For the duration of her performance, she controlled their attention, their emotions, and their desires. It was a terrible kind of power, bought at the price of her dignity and her future prospects for a respectable life. But it was still power, and Theodora had learned early that power in any form was better than helplessness. As Theodora's reputation as a performer grew, she attracted the attention of Constantinople's wealthy elite, who were always looking for new forms of entertainment and sexual gratification. This led to invitations to private parties that took place in the mansions and villas of the city's most powerful men, where the entertainment was even more explicit and degrading than what happened in the public theaters. These private performances were where Theodora earned the reputation that would follow her for the rest of her life. Historical accounts, particularly from the hostile historian Procopius, describe parties where she would perform sexual acts that were so extreme they shocked even Constantinople's jaded aristocracy. Whether these accounts are entirely accurate, or whether they represent exaggerated political propaganda designed to destroy her reputation, they reveal the world that Theodora inhabited during her teenage years. At these parties, the line between performance and prostitution disappeared entirely. Wealthy men didn't just want to watch erotic entertainment, they wanted to participate in it, and they had enough money to ensure that their desires were fulfilled. For women like Theodora, refusing these demands wasn't an option. The men who attended these parties included senators, generals, imperial officials, and wealthy merchants who could destroy anyone who displeased them with a single word to the right person. Theodora learned to navigate this world by developing psychological strategies that allowed her to maintain some sense of personal identity, even while her body was being used for other people's gratification. She became expert at reading her clients' psychology, understanding what they really wanted beyond the obvious sexual elements, and providing emotional and intellectual stimulation along with physical pleasure. Many of the men who hired her were driven by insecurities and fears that had nothing to do with sex. Some were terrified of losing their political positions and wanted reassurance that they were still powerful and desirable. Others were trapped in loveless marriages to women they had married for political reasons and craved the illusion of genuine affection. Still others were attempting to prove their masculinity to themselves or their peers through increasingly extreme sexual conquests. Theodora learned to provide whatever psychological satisfaction her clients needed while protecting her own emotional core from complete destruction. She developed what modern psychologists would recognize as dissociative strategies, mentally separating herself from what was happening to her body while remaining alert and responsive enough to avoid the violence that could result from displeasing a client. But perhaps most importantly, she began to gather information. In the intimate settings of these private parties, when men were drunk and sexually satisfied and temporarily off guard, they talked about things they would never discuss in public. They revealed their political plans, their financial problems, their family secrets, and their personal fears. Theodora memorized everything. She learned which senators were plotting against the emperor, which merchants were evading taxes, which generals were planning to rebel, and which imperial officials were taking bribes. She discovered that information was the most valuable commodity in Constantinople, and that people would pay enormous amounts of money for the right secrets delivered at the right time. Slowly, carefully, she began to transform herself from a victim of the system into someone who could manipulate it for her own benefit. It would be years before she could use this knowledge to change her circumstances. But even in the depths of her degradation, Theodora was planning her escape. Among the wealthy men who frequented these private entertainments was Hesebulus. a middle-aged bureaucrat who had recently been appointed as governor of Pentapolis, a province in North Africa. Unlike many of his peers, who viewed actresses and prostitutes as temporary diversions, Hagia became obsessed with Theodora. He began requesting her exclusively for his private parties, paying premium rates to ensure that she wouldn't be available to other clients. Hagia was physically unattractive, with a soft, flabby body that showed the effects of too much rich food and too little exercise. He had thin, greasy hair that he combed carefully over his balding scalp, and small, cruel eyes that seemed to calculate the cost of everything and everyone he encountered. His hands were soft from a lifetime of bureaucratic work, but they were also quick to strike when he was displeased. What made Hagia dangerous wasn't his physical presence, but his position in the imperial bureaucracy and his connections to other powerful men. As a provincial governor, he had the authority to impose taxes, command military units, and literally determine who lived or died in his territory. He also had access to information about imperial policy, military campaigns, and political developments that could be enormously valuable to the right people. For Theodora, Hagia represented both an opportunity and a terrible risk. If she could become his permanent mistress, she might escape the degrading world of Constantinople's theaters and live in relative luxury as the companion of a powerful man. But she also understood that making herself completely dependent on one man would give him total control over her life, in ways that might be even more dangerous than her current situation. When Hagia first approached her with the proposal that she accompany him to North Africa as his official mistress, Theodora was around 17 years old. She had been working in Constantinople's entertainment industry for 5 years, and she understood better than anyone else what her options were. She could continue working as an actress and prostitute until age, disease, or violence ended her career. She could try to find a husband from her own social class, which would mean a lifetime of poverty with a man who would always know about her past. Or she could take the enormous risk of trusting Hagia to provide her with a better life. The decision wasn't really a choice. In Constantinople, women in Theodora's position had virtually no agency over their own lives. If she refused Hagia's offer, he could easily ensure that she never worked in the city again. If she accepted it, she would at least have a chance at something better, even if it meant placing herself completely at his mercy. Before leaving Constantinople, Theodora made a decision that revealed how much she had learned about survival and planning during her years in the entertainment industry. She used her savings and her connections to establish a small network of informants and allies in the city, people who would gather information and watch for opportunities while she was away. She also arranged for several of her secrets about powerful men to be revealed if she disappeared or died suspiciously, creating a form of insurance that might protect her from the worst of Hagia's potential cruelty. Then she boarded a ship for the voyage to North Africa, not knowing whether she was sailing toward salvation or toward an even more terrible form of captivity. The provincial capital of Pentapolis was a world away from Constantinople's crowded, violent streets. Located on the Mediterranean coast of what is now Libya, it was a prosperous trading city, with wide boulevards lined with palm trees, elegant villas overlooking the harbor, and markets filled with exotic goods from across Africa and the Middle East. Hagia's governor's palace was a sprawling complex of buildings and gardens that had been built during the height of Roman power and recently renovated to reflect Byzantine tastes and styles. The main residence featured marble floors, frescoed walls, and furnished rooms that were larger than the entire tenement building where Theodora had grown up. Gardens filled with flowering plants and fruit trees surrounded the buildings, and slaves attended to every need of the governor and his household. For Theodora, arriving at this palace after years of living in Constantinople's slums was like stepping into a fantasy. She had her own suite of rooms, with a private bathroom that featured hot and cold running water. She had access to a wardrobe of expensive clothes made from silk and other luxury fabrics. She dined on foods she had never imagined existed, served on gold and silver plates by servants who treated her with the respect due to the governor's official companion. But luxury, Theodora quickly discovered, could be its own form of prison. Heliopolis expected complete control over every aspect of her life. She couldn't leave the palace without his permission and an armed escort. She couldn't receive visitors or send messages without his knowledge. She was expected to be available for his sexual demands at any time of day or night, and she was forbidden from showing any sign of interest in other men, even in casual conversation. More troubling was Heliopolis' psychological cruelty. He seemed to take pleasure in reminding Theodora of her dependence on him, frequently describing in detail what would happen to her if she displeased him. He would have her stripped naked and beaten for minor infractions like speaking without permission or failing to show sufficient enthusiasm for his sexual advances. He enjoyed forcing her to perform increasingly degrading acts, not because they gave him physical pleasure, but because they demonstrated his complete power over her. Heliopolis also used Theodora's presence to enhance his own status among the local elite and visiting officials from Constantinople. He would display her at official functions like a valuable piece of property, encouraging other men to admire her beauty while making it clear that she belonged exclusively to him. These displays served multiple purposes. They demonstrated his wealth and taste. They reinforced his authority over his household, and they reminded everyone that he had access to pleasures that other men could only dream of. For nearly 2 years, Theodora endured this life, playing the role of the grateful mistress, while mentally cataloging everything she learned about provincial administration, imperial politics, and the psychology of powerful men. She listened carefully to Heliopolis' conversations with other officials, learning about military campaigns, tax policies, religious disputes, and the complex network of alliances and rivalries that connected the various levels of Byzantine government. She also studied the local population, learning about the tensions between different ethnic and religious groups, the economic factors that drove political loyalty, and the ways that imperial policies affected ordinary people's lives. This knowledge would prove invaluable years later when she was making decisions that affected the entire empire. But most importantly, Theodora was learning patience and strategic thinking. She understood that her current situation was temporary, that Heliopolis would eventually grow tired of her or find someone new, and that she needed to be prepared for whatever came next. She couldn't escape from Pentapolis on her own, but she could ensure that when the opportunity arose, she would be ready to seize it. That opportunity came suddenly and violently, in a confrontation that revealed both Heliopolis' capacity for cruelty and Theodora's refusal to be completely broken by her circumstances. The end of Theodora's relationship with Heliopolis began with what seemed like a minor incident, but quickly escalated into a confrontation that would change the trajectory of her entire life. During a dinner party with several visiting officials from Constantinople, one of the guests made a casual comment about Theodora's intelligence, praising her ability to discuss theological questions with insight and sophistication. The compliment was innocent enough, but it triggered something dark in Heliopolis' psychology. He had always been insecure about his own intellectual abilities, and hearing another man praise Theodora's mind reminded him that his mistress might be more intelligent than he was. For a man whose sense of masculinity depended on maintaining absolute dominance over everyone in his household, this was an intolerable threat. After the guests left, Heliopolis confronted Theodora about what he saw as her attempt to humiliate him in front of his peers. When she tried to explain that she had simply answered the guests' questions politely, he flew into a rage unlike anything she had witnessed before. He accused her of trying to seduce the visitor, of plotting against him, and of forgetting her place in his household. The beating that followed was savage even by the standards of their relationship. Hysebulus didn't stop with his usual slapping and shoving. He used a leather whip that left permanent scars on Theodora's back and arms. He threatened to have her sold to a brothel that catered to the roughest soldiers and sailors. Most dangerously, he declared that he was tired of her presence and was considering whether to have her killed rather than deal with the complications of sending her away. But something had changed in Theodora during her years in Pentapolis. The desperate girl, who would have submitted to any abuse to survive, had been replaced by a woman who understood power, patience, and the importance of choosing the right moment to fight back. Instead of begging for mercy, she looked Hysebulus directly in the eyes and spoke with a calmness that unnerved him. She told him that if he was planning to kill her, he should do it immediately, because if he hesitated, she would find a way to destroy him. She reminded him of the secrets she knew about his financial corruption, his unofficial agreements with local tribal leaders, and his private correspondence with certain senators in Constantinople who were not entirely loyal to Emperor Justin. She explained in vivid detail what would happen to his career and his life if those secrets became public knowledge. For the first time in their relationship, Hysebulus realized that his mistress was not entirely helpless. Theodora had been gathering information about his activities for months, and she had somehow managed to establish contacts who could spread damaging stories even if she was dead. The power dynamic that had defined their relationship suddenly became more complex and dangerous. Hypsebulus's response was both predictable and revealing. Instead of apologizing or attempting to negotiate, he decided to rid himself of the problem by making Theodora disappear entirely. But he was too cautious and too paranoid to risk killing her himself. Instead, he chose what he thought was a more elegant solution. On a warm morning in early spring, Hysebulus informed Theodora that she was being sent back to Constantinople immediately. But when she went to pack her belongings, she discovered that her jewelry, her expensive clothes, and even her personal letters had already been removed from her rooms. She was given a single plain dress and told that a ship was waiting to transport her. But the ship wasn't going to Constantinople. As Theodora would discover only after it was too late to resist, Hysebulus had arranged for her to be taken to Alexandria in Egypt and sold to a brothel owner who specialized in breaking difficult women and turning them into completely compliant prostitutes. In Hysebulus's mind, this was perfect revenge. Theodora would suffer a fate worse than death, but he would have no direct connection to her destruction. It was a plan that might have worked against most women in Theodora's position. But Hysebulus had made one critical error in his calculations. He had underestimated how much his former mistress had learned during their time together, and he had failed to understand that Theodora had been preparing for betrayal from the moment she arrived in Pentapolis. The voyage from Pentapolis to Alexandria should have been Theodora's death sentence. She was 20 years old, alone, with no money, and no connections in a foreign land where she didn't even speak the local languages. The ship's captain had been paid to deliver her to a specific brothel owner, and he had instructions to ensure that she didn't escape during the journey. But during the voyage, something happened that revealed both Theodora's developing political instincts and the network of contacts she had been building throughout her years of degradation. One of the ship's officers recognized her from his visits to Constantinople's theaters, and instead of seeing her as a fallen woman being transported to her doom, he saw her as a potential source of valuable information. This officer, whose name has been lost to history, but who appears to have been an agent gathering intelligence for imperial officials in Constantinople, approached Theodora privately and offered her a deal. If she could provide him with detailed information about Hysebulus's administration in Pentapolis, including evidence of corruption and disloyalty, he would help her escape when they reached Alexandria and provide her with enough money to support herself while she planned her next moves. The negotiation that followed revealed how much Theodora had changed during her years of abuse and manipulation. Instead of agreeing immediately to any offer of help, she questioned the officer carefully about his connections his motivations, and his ability to fulfill his promises. She demanded guarantees and insisted on specific arrangements for how their agreement would be implemented. Most importantly, she used the opportunity to demonstrate the value of what she was offering. She provided the officer with samples of her intelligence about Hecebolus' activities, including details about his financial arrangements with local tribal leaders and his private correspondence with potentially disloyal senators in Constantinople. The information was so specific and so damaging that the officer realized he was dealing with someone who could be an enormous asset to his superiors in the imperial intelligence network. By the time they reached Alexandria, Theodora had transformed her status from victim to valuable intelligence asset. Instead of being delivered to a brothel, she was taken to a safe house and provided with enough resources to begin planning her next steps. But more importantly, she had established her first connection to the networks of spies, informants, and intelligence officers who would eventually help her rise to power. Alexandria, in the early 6th century, was one of the Roman Empire's greatest cities, a cosmopolitan center of trade, learning, and religious diversity that rivaled Constantinople itself. The city was home to the famous Library of Alexandria, the lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the world, and a population that included Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, Arabs, Nubians, and representatives of every culture that touched the Mediterranean world. For Theodora, Alexandria represented something she had never experienced before: the possibility of reinventing herself completely. Unlike Constantinople, where everyone knew her background and her reputation, Alexandria was a place where she could create a new identity and new possibilities for her future. She spent several months in the city, supporting herself through a combination of intelligence work for imperial agents and more conventional employment in Alexandria's textile industry. But her real education during this period was in religion and philosophy. Alexandria was the intellectual capital of the Christian world, home to theological schools, libraries, and religious communities that represented every variant of Christian belief. Theodora began studying Christian theology, not because she was particularly religious, but because she understood that religion was becoming an increasingly important factor in imperial politics. The Byzantine Empire was deeply divided by theological controversies that seemed abstract but had enormous political implications. Understanding these religious debates and the personalities involved in them could provide advantages that went far beyond spiritual enlightenment. She was particularly drawn to monophysite Christianity, a theological position that was considered heretical by the official imperial church, but was popular among many ordinary Christians, especially in Egypt and Syria. Monophysite theology appealed to Theodora, partly because it was the religion of outsiders and marginalized communities, people who understood what it meant to be rejected by official authority. But her interest in monophysitism was also strategic. She recognized that religious minorities often developed strong networks of mutual support, and that they were frequently looking for powerful patrons who could protect them from persecution. If she could position herself as a protector of monophysite communities, she might be able to build a base of political support that was independent of Constantinople's traditional power structures. During her time in Alexandria, Theodora also continued to develop her understanding of economics and trade. She invested her modest savings in small trading ventures, learning how goods moved through Mediterranean markets and how information about supply, demand, and political developments could be converted into financial profit. Most importantly, she began to understand that her experiences of exploitation and abuse, while personally devastating, had given her insights into human psychology and political dynamics that could be enormously valuable. She knew how power worked from the perspective of its victims. She understood how ordinary people thought and felt about their rulers. She had learned to read the psychology of powerful men and to identify their weaknesses and vulnerabilities. These skills, combined with her growing knowledge of religion, politics, and economics, were transforming her into something that the Byzantine Empire had rarely seen. A woman who understood power from every angle and who was determined to acquire it for herself. After nearly 3 years in Egypt and other parts of the Eastern Mediterranean, Theodora made the decision to return to Constantinople. But she wasn't returning as the desperate actress who had fled with Hecebolus years earlier. She was coming back as a woman who had been educated by suffering, who had learned to transform weakness into strength, and who understood that her background, rather than being a permanent barrier to success, could be converted into a unique form of political capital. The Constantinople she found upon her return in 522 AD was a city in transition. Emperor Justin I was aging and increasingly frail, and everyone understood that the succession would soon pass to his nephew Justinian. This created opportunities for ambitious people who could position themselves advantageously during the power transition. But it also created dangers for anyone who chose the wrong side or who failed to understand the complex political dynamics at work. Theodora's first challenge was re-establishing herself in Constantinople's social hierarchy without falling back into the degrading world of theater and prostitution that had defined her earlier life. She used her savings from her years in Alexandria to rent a small house in a respectable neighborhood, and she began presenting herself as a reformed woman who had found religious faith and was now living a virtuous life. This transformation wasn't just a matter of changing her behavior or appearance. Theodora had developed a sophisticated understanding of Constantinople's religious and political landscape, and she used this knowledge to build connections with influential people who might normally have avoided association with someone from her background. She began attending theological discussions and religious services, not as a desperate woman seeking charity, but as an intelligent participant who could contribute meaningfully to complex discussions about Christian doctrine and imperial policy. Her years of studying Monophysite theology in Alexandria had given her expertise that impressed even educated clerics and government officials. She also used her intelligence connections to provide valuable information to various political factions, carefully balancing her loyalties to avoid becoming too closely associated with any single group. The information she had gathered about provincial administration, religious controversies, and the activities of various imperial officials made her a valuable asset to multiple competing interests. But Theodora's most important strategic decision during this period was her choice of which powerful men to approach and how to present herself to them. She understood that her reputation as a former actress and prostitute would always be a liability. But she also recognized that the right person might see her background as an asset rather than a problem. The person she chose to approach was Justinian, heir to the imperial throne, and a man notorious for his intellectual brilliance, his political ambition, and his complete inability to understand or connect with ordinary people. Justinian was exactly the kind of person who might appreciate what Theodora could offer: intelligence about how common people thought and lived, connections to networks that no respectable politician could access, and the psychological insights that came from experiencing power from the perspective of its victims. But approaching Justinian required careful planning and perfect timing. A direct approach would have been impossible. A man in his position couldn't be seen meeting privately with a former prostitute without causing a massive scandal. Instead, Theodora had to arrange to encounter him in circumstances that would allow them to have meaningful conversations while maintaining the appearance of accidental social meetings. She accomplished this through her connections to Constantinople's religious community. Justinian was deeply interested in theological questions, and he frequently attended religious discussions and debates. Theodora began appearing at these same events, always contributing intelligently to the discussions and gradually establishing herself as someone whose opinions Justinian found interesting and valuable. The attraction that developed between them was complicated and multi-layered. On one level, it was physical. Theodora, at 25, was an extraordinarily beautiful woman who knew exactly how to present herself to maximum advantage. But more importantly, it was intellectual and political. Justinian had never encountered a woman who could match his intelligence while bringing completely different life experiences and perspectives to their conversations. For Theodora, the developing relationship represented the opportunity she had been preparing for throughout all her years of suffering and education. Justinian was brilliant, ambitious, and positioned to become the most powerful man in the world. If she could make herself indispensable to his success, she might achieve a level of power and influence that no woman in her position had ever imagined possible. But she also understood that the relationship would be enormously dangerous. If it became public knowledge before she had secured her position, it could destroy both of their careers. If she misjudged Justinian's character or his commitment to her, she could find herself in an even more vulnerable position than she had been during her years in the entertainment industry. The courtship that developed between Theodora and Justinian was conducted with the secrecy and strategic planning of a military campaign. But it was also genuine in ways that surprised both of them. After years of relationships that were based entirely on exploitation and power dynamics, both of them discovered that it was possible to find someone who could be both a political partner and a source of personal fulfillment. The secret relationship between Theodora and Justinian developed over nearly 2 years, during which they met regularly at religious gatherings, private dinner parties, and other social events where their conversations could seem accidental rather than planned. What began as mutual intellectual fascination gradually deepened into something that was both a genuine emotional connection and a formidable political alliance. For Justinian, who had spent his entire adult life surrounded by people who told him what they thought he wanted to hear, Theodora's willingness to disagree with him was intoxicating. She challenged his ideas, offered alternative perspectives on complex problems, and demonstrated a level of political sophistication that impressed even him. When he discussed his plans for reforming the empire's legal system, she pointed out flaws in his reasoning that his other advisors missed. When he described his military strategies for reconquering the Western Roman Empire, she identified potential problems with supply lines and local opposition that his generals hadn't considered. More importantly, Theodora gave Justinian access to information and perspectives that no one else in his circle could provide. She knew how imperial policies affected ordinary people, how religious controversies played out in neighborhood taverns and market squares, and how the empire's enemies were perceived by the populations they hoped to conquer. This knowledge was invaluable to someone planning to rule an empire, but it was knowledge that could only come from someone who had lived at every level of society. For Theodora, the relationship with Justinian represented both the culmination of everything she had been working toward and the most dangerous gamble of her life. If their relationship became public knowledge, before she had secured her position legally, it could destroy both of their careers and probably result in her death. Byzantine law specifically prohibited marriages between senators and actresses, and Justinian's position as heir to the throne made him subject to even stricter regulations about his personal relationships. But Theodora also understood that this was likely her only opportunity to achieve the kind of power and influence that could protect her from the vulnerabilities that had defined her entire life. If she could become Justinian's wife and partner in ruling the empire, she would never again be dependent on anyone else's mercy or charity. She would have the power to protect not only herself, but other people who found themselves in situations similar to what she had experienced. The decision to make their relationship public came when Emperor Justin's health began to decline rapidly, and it became clear that the imperial succession would happen sooner rather than later. Justinian needed to marry before becoming emperor, both to ensure the dynasty's continuation and to demonstrate his stability and respectability to the empire's elite. But instead of choosing a conventional imperial bride from one of Constantinople's aristocratic families, Justinian shocked the entire Byzantine establishment by announcing his intention to marry Theodora. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Senators who had supported Justinian's political career declared that they would oppose his succession if he insisted on this unsuitable marriage. Military commanders questioned whether soldiers would respect an emperor who had married a former prostitute. Religious leaders debated whether such a marriage would be recognized by God or whether it represented a form of spiritual corruption that would bring divine punishment on the empire. The crisis reached its peak when several prominent senators announced that they were considering supporting an alternative candidate for emperor if Justinian refused to reconsider his marriage plans. For a brief period, it seemed possible that Justinian's determination to marry Theodora would cost him the throne and plunge the empire into civil war. But Justinian's response to this opposition revealed both his political skill and the depth of his commitment to Theodora. Instead of backing down or attempting to compromise, he chose to fight the opposition directly by changing the law that prohibited his marriage. Working with his uncle Emperor Justin, who was still legally competent despite his declining health, Justinian convinced the imperial government to pass new legislation that allowed former actresses to marry into the nobility if they had renounced their previous professions and embraced a life of Christian virtue. The law was carefully written to apply specifically to Theodora's situation, and it created a legal precedent that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. The law change was controversial enough, but what really shocked Constantinople's elite was the public ceremony that accompanied Theodora and Justinian's wedding. Instead of a quiet, private ceremony that might have minimized the scandal, they chose to have a massive public celebration that made their marriage the most talked about event in the empire's recent history. The wedding ceremony took place in the Hagia Sophia, Constantinople's greatest church, with hundreds of the empire's most powerful people in attendance. Theodora wore a crown of gold and precious stones that had been specially created for the occasion, and her wedding dress was made of silk embroidered with pearls that had been imported from the Indian Ocean at enormous expense. But what made the ceremony truly revolutionary was the way Theodora conducted herself throughout the proceedings. Instead of appearing humble and grateful, as everyone expected, she carried herself with the confidence and dignity of someone who belonged in the imperial family by right rather than by charity. She spoke her wedding vows clearly and firmly, and she looked directly at the assembled aristocrats and officials as if daring them to challenge her right to be there. For the people of Constantinople who witnessed this transformation, it was almost impossible to believe that the woman standing beside their future emperor was the same person who had once performed in the city's theaters and brothels. Theodora had not just changed her circumstances, she had completely reinvented her identity and her relationship to power itself. When Emperor Justin died in August 527 AD, Justinian and Theodora ascended to the throne as equal partners in a way that had never been seen before in Roman or Byzantine history. Previous empresses had been important as mothers of heirs, as diplomatic assets through marriage alliances, or as symbols of imperial piety and virtue. But they had never been expected to participate actively in governing the empire or to have opinions about military strategy, economic policy, or foreign relations. Theodora shattered these expectations from her first day as empress. She insisted on being present at all important government meetings. She expressed her opinions freely on all major policy decisions, and she made it clear that she expected to be consulted before any significant actions were taken. Most shockingly, she sometimes disagreed publicly with Justinian's decisions and occasionally overruled him when she thought he was wrong. The imperial court, which had developed elaborate protocols over centuries to manage the behavior of emperors and empresses, simply didn't know how to handle this unprecedented situation. Senators and generals who were accustomed to having their advice accepted without question found themselves being questioned, challenged, and sometimes corrected by an empress who had opinions about everything and the intelligence to back up her arguments with facts and logic. Theodora's approach to imperial power was shaped fundamentally by her life experiences. Unlike previous empresses who had grown up in privileged circumstances and understood power as something that came naturally with birth and social position, Theodora understood power as something that had to be fought for, defended constantly, and used strategically to protect yourself and the people you cared about. She also brought to the imperial throne a level of political sophistication that came from having observed power from every possible angle. She had been powerless and vulnerable. She had been protected by powerful patrons. She had been exploited by people who controlled her life. And she had learned to manipulate others when manipulation was her only option for survival. This comprehensive understanding of how power worked made her more effective as a ruler than people who had only experienced power from positions of privilege. One of Theodora's first initiatives as empress was to establish her own independent intelligence network that operated parallel to the official imperial intelligence services. She used her connections from her years in Constantinople's underworld, Alexandria's religious communities, and various provincial cities to create a comprehensive information-gathering system that kept her informed about potential threats, opportunities, and the real opinions of people throughout the empire. This intelligence network served multiple purposes. It gave Theodora advance warning of plots against the imperial government. It provided her with information about the effectiveness of imperial policies at the local level, and it allowed her to identify people who might be useful allies or dangerous enemies. But perhaps most importantly, it gave her independent sources of information that didn't depend on Justinian's advisors or official government channels. Theodora also began immediately to use her position to advance legal and social reforms that reflected her personal experiences and values. She convinced Justinian to pass laws prohibiting the forced prostitution of young girls, making it easier for women to obtain divorces from abusive husbands, and providing legal protections for women who wanted to leave the entertainment industry and marry into respectable society. These weren't just symbolic gestures designed to improve Theodora's public image. They were comprehensive legal reforms that changed the fundamental structure of Byzantine society and provided protections for vulnerable people that hadn't existed before. The laws were also carefully crafted to be enforceable rather than just theoretical, with specific penalties for violations and clear procedures for people to seek legal remedies when their rights were violated. But perhaps Theodora's most controversial initiative during her early years as empress was her patronage of Monophysite Christianity. Despite the fact that Justinian's government officially supported Chalcedonian Christianity, which considered monophysitism to be heretical, Theodora began providing financial support, legal protection, and political advocacy for monophysite communities throughout the empire. This religious patronage was partly based on Theodora's genuine theological beliefs, but it was also a sophisticated political strategy designed to build support for the imperial government among religious minorities who felt marginalized by official policies. Theodora understood that religious loyalty could be converted into political loyalty, and she worked systematically to create networks of supporters who were grateful to her personally, rather than just to the imperial government in general. In January 532 AD, just 5 years after Justinian and Theodora became emperor and empress, their reign faced its ultimate test. What began as a dispute about chariot racing quickly escalated into the most dangerous political crisis in Byzantine history, an event that became known as the Nika Riots, and that came within hours of ending both their rule and their lives. The immediate cause of the riots was a decision by the imperial government to execute several members of the blue and green factions who had been arrested for violence during recent chariot races. But the underlying causes were much deeper and more dangerous. Constantinople's population was angry about high taxes, religious policies they disagreed with, and what they perceived as corruption and incompetence in the imperial administration. Most dangerously, significant portions of the city's elite were secretly sympathetic to the rioters. Senators, wealthy merchants, and even some military commanders had never accepted Justinian's marriage to Theodora, and they saw the riots as an opportunity to force the emperor to abandon policies they opposed, or even to replace him with someone more to their liking. The riots began on January 13th with coordinated attacks on government buildings, the homes of imperial officials, and symbols of imperial authority throughout Constantinople. Within hours, large areas of the city were burning, and organized groups of rioters were marching toward the imperial palace chanting Nika, which meant conquer, and served as their rallying cry. By the third day of the riots, the situation had become catastrophic. The rioters controlled most of Constantinople, including the Hippodrome, the Senate House, and several of the city's major churches. They had proclaimed a new emperor, a senator named Hypatius, who was related to previous imperial families, and they were demanding that Justinian and Theodora surrender and leave the city immediately. Inside the imperial palace, panic was spreading among Justinian's advisors and supporters. Many of the empire's most experienced generals and senators were openly suggesting that the emperor and empress should flee Constantinople immediately while they still could. Ships were waiting in the harbor to take them to safety, and every hour they delayed increased the chance that they would be captured and executed by the rioters. The council meeting that took place on January 18th, the sixth day of the riots, was one of the most dramatic moments in Byzantine history. Justinian, faced with unanimous advice from his counselors to flee the city, seemed ready to accept their recommendation and abandon his throne to save his life. But then Theodora stood up to speak, and what she said changed the course of the crisis and revealed the full extent of her transformation from powerless victim to political genius. Her speech, which was recorded by court historians and has been preserved in multiple versions, was both a masterpiece of political rhetoric and a window into the psychology of someone who had learned that survival sometimes required risking everything on a single decision. She began by acknowledging the danger they faced, but then she pointed out that fleeing would not guarantee their safety. As former rulers, they would spend the rest of their lives as refugees, always vulnerable to assassination by their enemies and dependent on the charity of foreign rulers who might decide at any moment that harboring them was too dangerous. More importantly, she argued that the riots, while dangerous, also represented an opportunity. If they could defeat this rebellion decisively, they would eliminate their political opposition permanently and establish their authority more firmly than ever before. If they fled, they would be admitting that they couldn't handle a crisis, and they would invite future rebellions by demonstrating that determined opposition could force them to abandon their responsibilities. But the most famous part of Theodora's speech was her declaration that she would rather die as an empress than live as an exile. She pointed out that the purple imperial robes made an excellent burial shroud, and that dying with dignity was preferable to living in shame and powerlessness. The speech was carefully calculated to appeal to the masculine pride of Justinian and his advisors, while also making a strategic argument about why fighting was more rational than fleeing. But it was also genuinely courageous, delivered by someone who had faced death and degradation before, and who understood that sometimes the only way to win was to risk losing everything. Justinian, shamed by his wife's courage and convinced by her strategic analysis, decided to stay and fight. But implementing that decision would require tactics that were ruthless, even by Byzantine standards. The plan that Theodora and Justinian developed to end the Nika riots was brutal, systematic, and completely effective. Working with General Belisarius, one of the greatest military commanders in history, and General Mundus, a fierce Germanic warrior who commanded the Imperial Guard, they prepared a trap that would eliminate their enemies permanently. The key to their strategy was the Hippodrome itself, the same venue where young Theodora had once begged for help as a child, but which would now become the site of her most ruthless demonstration of imperial power. The plan was to allow the rebels to gather in the Hippodrome for a ceremony to crown their alternative emperor, then surround the building and eliminate everyone inside. On January 19th, the 7th day of the riots, Hypatia and his supporters gathered in the Hippodrome with thousands of their followers for what they believed would be the ceremony that would make him emperor and end Justinian's reign. The atmosphere was festive, with the crowd celebrating what they thought was their victory and the beginning of a new era in Byzantine politics. But while the rebels were celebrating, Belisarius and Mundus were positioning their troops around the Hippodrome. The plan required perfect coordination and absolute ruthlessness, because once the killing began, there could be no half measures. Anyone who escaped would spread word of the massacre, potentially triggering even larger rebellions throughout the empire. The signal to begin the attack came from Theodora herself, watching from the imperial palace as the rebel ceremony reached its climax. When Hypatia was crowned with an improvised imperial diadem, she gave the order that began one of the most systematic massacres in Byzantine history. Belisarius' soldiers entered the Hippodrome from multiple entrances, trapping the crowd inside the massive structure. What followed was not a battle, but a slaughter. The rioters, packed tightly together and with no weapons except improvised clubs and stones, were helpless against trained soldiers with swords, spears, and military discipline. The killing continued for hours, with soldiers methodically working their way through the crowd and executing anyone they found. The orders were specific. No prisoners were to be taken, no mercy was to be shown, and no one was to be allowed to escape. The goal was not just to end the current rebellion, but to create a memory that would prevent future rebellions for generations. Conservative estimates put the death toll at around 30,000 people killed in a single day, though some sources suggest the number was even higher. The floor of the Hippodrome was literally covered with blood and bodies, and the stench of death lingered in the building for months afterward. But the massacre wasn't random violence or an emotional response to the crisis. It was calculated political terrorism, designed to send a message that would resonate throughout the empire. Theodora understood that mercy, in this situation, would be interpreted as weakness, and weakness would invite more challenges to imperial authority. The psychological impact of the massacre was exactly what Theodora had predicted. News of what happened in the Hippodrome spread throughout the empire within weeks, carried by merchants, soldiers, and government officials who witnessed the aftermath. The message was clear. Challenging Justinian and Theodora's authority would result not in negotiation or compromise, but in death. After the Nika riots, no one in Constantinople ever again seriously challenged Justinian's right to rule, and no one ever again questioned Theodora's right to exercise imperial power alongside her husband. The massacre had established their authority more firmly than any legal document or religious ceremony could have done. But the psychological cost of this victory was enormous, particularly for Theodora. She had demonstrated that she was willing to order the deaths of tens of thousands of people to protect her position, establishing her reputation as someone who was absolutely ruthless when her power was threatened. From that day forward, she would be feared as much as she was respected. With her political authority secured through the brutal suppression of the Nika riots, Theodora turned her attention to using imperial power to transform Byzantine society in ways that reflected her own experiences and values. What she accomplished over the next 15 years represents one of the most comprehensive legal and social reform programs in ancient history. Theodora's approach to legal reform was revolutionary because it was based on her understanding of how laws actually affected people's lives, rather than on abstract principles of justice or traditional legal precedents. She had lived under Byzantine law as someone who had no protections and no recourse when she was exploited or abused. And she was determined to create legal remedies for people who found themselves in similar situations. Her first major initiative focused on the legal status of women, particularly women from lower social classes, who were most vulnerable to exploitation. She convinced Justinian to pass comprehensive legislation that prohibited the forced prostitution of young girls, established severe penalties for anyone who sold children into sexual slavery, and created legal procedures that allowed women to escape from situations where they were being sexually exploited. These laws were revolutionary because they established, for the first time in Roman law, that women and girls had legal rights that couldn't be overridden by economic desperation, family decisions, or the financial interests of their owners or employers. Previously, parents had been legally permitted to sell their daughters into prostitution if the family faced starvation, and theater owners and brothel operators had been able to force women into sexual slavery through debt bondage and legal contracts. Theodora's new laws made these practices illegal and created enforcement mechanisms that actually worked. Imperial officials were given specific responsibilities for investigating reports of forced prostitution. Courts were required to hear complaints from women who claimed they were being sexually exploited, and penalties for violations included not just fines, but imprisonment and even execution for the most serious offenses. Theodora also revolutionized Byzantine divorce law, making it significantly easier for women to leave abusive marriages and establishing legal protections for women who sought divorces. Previously, Byzantine law had strongly favored men in divorce proceedings, and women who left their husbands often found themselves with no legal rights to property, children, or financial support. The new divorce laws established clear grounds for women to seek divorces, including physical abuse, adultery, and abandonment. They also created legal procedures for dividing property and determining child custody that took into account the woman's financial needs and the children's welfare rather than simply awarding everything to the husband. Perhaps most importantly, Theodora's divorce reforms established the legal principle that marriage was a partnership between equals rather than a form of ownership where the husband had absolute authority over his wife. This concept was so revolutionary that it took centuries for it to be fully accepted, even in Byzantine society, and it wouldn't appear in most European legal systems for another 1,000 years. But Theodora's most radical legal reform involved the treatment of actresses and other women who worked in the entertainment industry. She created new laws that allowed these women to leave their professions and marry into respectable society, exactly as she had done. She also established legal protections that prevented theater owners and brothel operators from forcing women to sign contracts that amounted to sexual slavery. These laws were particularly controversial because they challenged fundamental assumptions about social hierarchy and moral purity that had dominated Roman and Byzantine society for centuries. The traditional view was that women who had worked as actresses or prostitutes were permanently degraded and could never again be considered respectable members of society. Theodora's reforms established the legal principle that people could change their social status through their own actions, rather than being permanently defined by their birth circumstances or past mistakes. This concept was so radical that many of Constantinople's aristocrats and religious leaders refused to accept it, but it became part of official imperial law and created opportunities for social mobility that hadn't existed before. All of these legal reforms were carefully crafted to be practical and enforceable, rather than just theoretical statements of good intentions. Theodora had learned from her own experiences that laws were meaningless unless they could be enforced against people who had wealth and power, and she insisted on creating legal mechanisms that actually protected vulnerable people, rather than just making politicians feel good about themselves. While Justinian focused on his grand imperial projects like reconquering the Western Roman Empire, building the Hagia Sophia, and codifying Roman law, Theodora constructed what amounted to a parallel government that operated through networks of information, influence, and personal loyalty, rather than official authority. Theodora's intelligence network was legendary throughout the Byzantine world and represented something that had never been seen before: a comprehensive information-gathering system controlled by an empress who used it to advance her own political agenda independently of her husband's policies. She maintained contacts with people at every level of society, from palace servants to foreign ambassadors, from religious leaders in distant provinces to merchants trading in exotic goods from Asia and Africa. This information network served multiple overlapping purposes. It provided Theodora with early warning of potential threats to imperial authority. It gave her detailed intelligence about the effectiveness of government policies at the local level, and it allowed her to identify opportunities for advancing her own political and religious agenda. But perhaps most importantly, it made her genuinely indispensable to Justinian's success as emperor. The information that Theodora gathered through her networks often contradicted the reports that Justinian received through official government channels. Provincial governors would send optimistic reports about the success of imperial policies, while Theodora's informants revealed that these same policies were creating resentment and opposition among the local population. Military commanders would claim that their campaigns were proceeding successfully, while Theodora's intelligence indicated that they were facing supply problems, morale issues, and stronger enemy resistance than they were admitting. This independent intelligence capability gave Theodora enormous influence over imperial decision-making. When Justinian's official advisors recommended a particular course of action, Theodora could provide alternative analysis based on information that no one else had access to. When conflicts arose between different government departments or military commanders, Theodora often had better intelligence about the real facts than either side in the dispute. But Theodora's information network wasn't just passive intelligence gathering. She used it actively to advance her political agenda by identifying allies who could be cultivated, enemies who needed to be neutralized, and opportunities for expanding imperial influence in ways that wouldn't have been possible through conventional diplomatic or military channels. One of the most sophisticated aspects of Theodora's intelligence operations was her use of religious networks to gather information and build political influence throughout the empire. Through her patronage of monophysite Christianity, she had established connections with religious communities in Egypt, Syria, Armenia, and other regions that felt marginalized by Constantinople's official religious policies. These religious networks provided Theodora with detailed intelligence about local political conditions, economic developments, and potential security threats in regions that were often poorly monitored by official imperial administration. They also gave her the ability to influence local politics through religious leaders who were grateful for her protection and financial support. Theodora's religious intelligence network was particularly valuable during the empire's ongoing conflicts with Persia and the emerging Arab states. Religious minorities in border regions often had more accurate information about enemy military preparations than imperial military intelligence, and they were sometimes willing to share this information with Theodora, even when they wouldn't cooperate with local imperial officials whom they didn't trust. She also used her intelligence networks to monitor and sometimes manipulate the activities of Justinian's generals and administrators. When she disagreed with military strategies or administrative policies, she would often use her information contacts to create pressure for policy changes without directly challenging Justinian's authority in public. For example, if she opposed a particular military campaign, she might arrange for information about logistical problems or enemy preparations to reach influential senators or religious leaders who would then pressure Justinian to reconsider his plans. If she disapproved of a provincial governor's policies, she might ensure that reports of corruption or incompetence reached the attention of imperial auditors who would investigate and potentially remove the official. This indirect approach to political influence allowed Theodora to exercise enormous power while maintaining the appearance of supporting her husband's decisions. She could achieve her political objectives without creating the kind of public conflicts that might have forced Justinian to choose between his wife's preferences and his other advisors' recommendations. Theodora's most controversial and ultimately most significant political initiative was her systematic support for monophysite Christianity, a theological position that was considered heretical by the official imperial church, but that commanded the loyalty of millions of Christians throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. The theological controversy that divided Byzantine Christianity in the 6th century seems abstract and irrelevant to modern readers, but it had enormous political implications that Theodora understood better than most of her contemporaries. The dispute centered on the nature of Christ. Chalcedonian Christians, supported by the official imperial church, believed that Christ had two natures, human and divine, that remained distinct even after the incarnation. Monophysite Christians believed that Christ had a single divine nature that absorbed his human characteristics. But this theological debate was really about political authority and cultural identity. Monophysite Christianity was popular primarily among non-Greek populations in Egypt, Syria, Armenia, and other regions that had been conquered by the Roman Empire, but that maintained their own languages, cultures, and political traditions. Supporting monophysite theology was often a way of expressing resistance to Greek cultural dominance and Constantinople's political control. Theodora's support for monophysitism wasn't based primarily on theological conviction, though she may have found its emphasis on divine transcendence psychologically appealing, given her own experiences of transformation from degradation to power. Her religious patronage was fundamentally a political strategy designed to build support for imperial authority among populations that felt marginalized by official policies. This religious strategy required incredible political skill and personal courage. Justinian's government officially supported Chalcedonian Christianity and was committed to maintaining unity with the Roman Church, which also opposed monophysitism. Theodora's open support for what was officially considered heretical theology created potential conflicts with her husband's policies and gave their enemies opportunities to attack both of them as religiously unreliable. But Theodora managed to pursue her religious agenda while maintaining imperial unity through a combination of careful political maneuvering and creative institutional arrangements. She provided financial support and legal protection to monophysite communities while publicly maintaining her loyalty to imperial religious policies. She arranged for monophysite bishops to be secretly consecrated and installed in regions where they commanded popular support, while ensuring that these appointments didn't directly challenge the authority of officially recognized Chalcedonian bishops. Most dramatically, Theodora provided sanctuary within the imperial palace itself for monophysite religious leaders who were being persecuted by imperial religious authorities. She literally hid these bishops and theologians in her private apartments, protecting them from arrest, while continuing to appear publicly at official religious ceremonies alongside her husband. This religious double game required not just political skill, but also remarkable personal courage. If Theodora's covert religious activities had been fully exposed, they could have been used to justify charges of heresy against both her and Justinian, potentially leading to their removal from power and execution. But the long-term benefits of Theodora's religious strategy were enormous. Her support helped preserve monophysite Christianity during a period when it might otherwise have been completely suppressed by imperial persecution. More importantly, her religious patronage created networks of political loyalty that benefited the Byzantine Empire for centuries. Monophysite communities throughout Egypt, Syria, and Armenia that might otherwise have been hostile to Byzantine rule became sources of support for imperial authority because they were grateful for Theodora's protection. When these regions faced invasion by Persian armies, or later, by Arab Muslim forces, many monophysite Christians supported Byzantine resistance efforts, partly because they remembered Theodora's patronage. Theodora's religious politics also established important precedents for how the Byzantine Empire could manage religious diversity without requiring complete uniformity of belief. Her example showed that political unity could coexist with theological diversity if religious minorities were treated with respect and given meaningful protection, rather than being subjected to systematic persecution. Beyond her legal reforms and religious politics, Theodora demonstrated an understanding of economic policy and financial strategy that was centuries ahead of her time. She recognized that political power ultimately depended on economic resources, and she worked systematically to build independent sources of wealth and influence that didn't depend entirely on imperial favor or her relationship with Justinian. Theodora's economic activities began with her understanding of how trade networks functioned throughout the Mediterranean world. During her years in Alexandria and other eastern cities, she had learned about the complex commercial relationships that connected Constantinople with markets in India, China, Africa, and Western Europe. She understood that controlling trade routes meant controlling information, and that information could be converted into both political influence and financial profit. As Empress, Theodora invested heavily in trading ventures that connected Constantinople with distant markets. She provided financial backing for merchant expeditions to India and China. She invested in ships and caravans that carried luxury goods throughout the Mediterranean, and she established commercial relationships with traders who operated in regions that were poorly connected to official imperial commercial networks. These trading investments generated enormous profits that Theodora used to fund her political activities, but they also created networks of commercial relationships that provided her with intelligence about political and economic developments throughout the known world. Merchants who owed their prosperity to her investment were valuable sources of information about foreign governments, military preparations, and economic opportunities that might benefit the Byzantine Empire. Theodora also pioneered what we would today recognize as early forms of banking and finance. She provided loans and investment capital to merchants, craftsmen, and other entrepreneurs throughout the empire, creating a network of economic relationships that generated both financial returns and political loyalty. These financial activities were carefully structured to provide maximum benefit while minimizing political risk. Theodora never allowed her commercial interests to conflict with imperial policy, and she was careful to ensure that her business relationships enhanced rather than undermined Justinian's authority. But perhaps most importantly, her economic activities provided her with independent financial resources that allowed her to pursue her political agenda without depending entirely on imperial funds. When she wanted to support monophysite religious communities, she could use her own wealth rather than requiring Justinian to approve expenditures that might have been politically controversial. Theodora's economic independence also gave her influence over imperial policy that went beyond her formal position as empress. When the imperial government faced financial difficulties, as it frequently did during Justinian's expensive military campaigns and building projects, Theodora's wealth and commercial connections made her an important source of alternative funding and financial advice. She was involved in currency policy, tax assessment, and trade regulation in ways that previous empresses had never been. Her understanding of how economic policies affected ordinary people's lives, gained during her years of poverty and struggle, made her a valuable advisor on issues that Justinian and his other counselors often didn't fully understand. Theodora also used her economic influence to advance her social reform agenda. When she wanted to establish shelters for women escaping from prostitution, she could fund these facilities herself rather than requesting imperial appropriations that might have been denied or delayed. When she wanted to provide legal assistance to women seeking divorces from abusive husbands, she could hire lawyers and pay court costs without creating political complications for Justinian. This integration of economic strategy with political objectives made Theodora more effective as a reformer than she would have been if she had depended entirely on official imperial authority to achieve her goals. Her economic independence allowed her to pursue long-term social changes, even when immediate political circumstances made official government action impossible. Throughout her nearly 20 years as empress, Theodora faced constant challenges from people who wanted to undermine her influence, reduce her role in government, or eliminate her entirely. These weren't casual political disagreements, but systematic campaigns designed to convince Justinian that his wife was a liability, who threatened the stability and respectability of his reign. The opposition to Theodora came from multiple sources and was based on different but overlapping concerns. Traditional aristocrats resented her low birth and her rise to power through what they considered illegitimate means. Military commanders opposed her influence over strategic decisions and her tendency to question their professional judgment. Religious leaders were suspicious of her theological views and her protection of communities they considered heretical. Foreign governments hoped that removing her would make the Byzantine Empire easier to manipulate or defeat. What made these challenges particularly dangerous was that they were often coordinated and supported by people who were otherwise loyal to Justinian and the imperial government. Theodora's enemies weren't rebels or traitors in the conventional sense. They were respected senators, successful generals, and influential religious figures who sincerely believed that the empire would be stronger without her participation in government. Theodora's response to these challenges revealed the full extent of her political genius and the lessons she had learned during her years of surviving in hostile environments. Rather than confronting her enemies directly, which would have created the kind of open conflict that might have forced Justinian to choose between his wife and his other advisors, she developed more subtle strategies for neutralizing threats to her position. She became expert at identifying the personal weaknesses and vulnerabilities of her political enemies, then using that information to destroy their credibility without leaving fingerprints that could be traced back to her. A general who was plotting against her might suddenly discover that his financial irregularities had been noticed by imperial auditors. A senator who questioned her influence might find that his son's gambling debts or sexual indiscretions had become the subject of embarrassing gossip throughout Constantinople. These revelations always seemed to emerge naturally from routine investigations or casual social conversations, rather than appearing to be the result of deliberate intelligence operations. Theodora's enemies would find their reputations destroyed and their political influence eliminated, but they would rarely be able to prove that she had been responsible for their downfall. Theodora also mastered the art of strategic alliance building, creating temporary partnerships with people who might otherwise have been her enemies when those alliances served her purposes. She understood that political loyalty was usually temporary and situational, so she never relied on anyone's permanent friendship, but she was always willing to work with former enemies when their interests aligned with hers. For example, when she disagreed with one of Justinian's military strategies, she might build a coalition of senators, religious leaders, and even military commanders who opposed the same policy for their own reasons. She would coordinate their opposition efforts while remaining in the background, allowing others to take the political risks associated with challenging imperial policy while ensuring that her preferred alternative would be adopted. Perhaps most importantly, Theodora learned to make herself genuinely indispensable to Justinian's success as emperor. She didn't just provide companionship or emotional support, though their personal relationship remained strong throughout their marriage. She provided political intelligence, strategic analysis, and administrative capabilities that Justinian couldn't get from anyone else. This wasn't manipulation in the conventional sense. It was a partnership where both parties benefited enormously from the other's strengths, but where Theodora made sure that her contributions were so valuable that Justinian would never consider governing without her. When military campaigns ran into difficulties, Theodora's intelligence networks often provided information that helped resolve the problems. When diplomatic negotiations reached impasses, her unofficial contacts with foreign governments sometimes opened alternative channels for communication, When domestic policies created unexpected opposition, her understanding of public opinion helped identify modifications that would make the policies more acceptable. By making herself essential to Justinian's effectiveness as emperor, Theodora created a form of political security that was more durable than any legal protection or official position could have provided. Her enemies might succeed in undermining her reputation or creating temporary difficulties for her, but they couldn't eliminate her without significantly damaging Justinian's ability to govern successfully. Theodora died in June 548 AD, probably from cancer, at the height of her power and influence. She was approximately 51 years old and had been empress for 21 years, during which she had transformed not only her own life, but the fundamental structure of Byzantine society and government. Her death devastated Justinian, who had depended on her partnership for every major decision of his reign. He never remarried, and contemporary observers noted that he seemed to lose much of his political effectiveness and personal vitality after her death. The remaining 17 years of his reign, while still notable for various achievements, lacked the innovative energy and strategic brilliance that had characterized the period when he and Theodora ruled together. But Theodora's impact on Byzantine history extended far beyond her personal relationship with her husband. The legal reforms she had championed became permanent parts of Byzantine law and influenced legal systems throughout Europe for centuries. Her example of female political authority changed expectations about what empresses could and should do, inspiring generations of powerful women in Byzantine courts and beyond. The intelligence networks and diplomatic contacts she had built continued to provide advantages for the Byzantine Empire long after her death. The relationships she had established with religious minorities, trade partners, and political allies throughout the Mediterranean created lasting benefits for Byzantine foreign policy and domestic stability. Her protection of monophysite Christianity helped preserve theological diversity within the Christian world and created forms of religious tolerance that wouldn't be matched in most of Europe for many centuries. The communities she had protected during her lifetime remained sources of support for Byzantine authority, even when they faced persecution from later emperors who didn't share her understanding of how religious diversity could be managed politically. But perhaps Theodora's most important legacy was the demonstration that political power could be achieved and maintained through intelligence, strategic thinking, and determination, regardless of social background or conventional qualifications. She proved that someone who started life in absolute poverty and degradation could not only reach the highest positions of authority, but could exercise that authority more effectively than people who had been born to rule. Her career challenged fundamental assumptions about social hierarchy, gender roles, and political legitimacy that had dominated European thinking for centuries. The idea that merit and ability might be more important than birth and social position, the concept that women could be effective political leaders, and the principle that people could transform their circumstances through their own efforts were all demonstrated by Theodora's example. These ideas wouldn't become generally accepted in European society for many centuries after her death, but her career proved that they were possible and provided inspiration for later generations of people who found themselves in situations similar to what she had experienced. The story of Theodora has been controversial since her own lifetime, and much of that controversy centers around questions that remain impossible to answer definitively. How much of what we know about her early life is historically accurate, and how much represents political propaganda designed to destroy her reputation? Was she a victim of exploitation who transformed herself into an agent of justice? Or was she a ruthless manipulator who used her experiences of abuse to justify later acts of cruelty? The most detailed accounts of Theodora's alleged sexual activities come from the historian Procopius, who wrote both official histories praising Justinian and Theodora, and a secret work called The Secret History that portrayed them as monsters and tyrants. The Secret History contains descriptions of Theodora's performances that are so graphic and extreme that many modern historians question whether they represent factual reporting or political pornography designed to discredit her. What complicates this historical puzzle is that Procopius had personal and political reasons to hate both Justinian and Theodora. He was a member of the traditional senatorial class that lost influence during their reign, and he was personally involved in military campaigns that he believed were mismanaged by imperial policies. His hostile accounts may reflect genuine historical facts, or they may represent the revenge fantasies of someone whose career and social position had been damaged by the changes that Justinian and Theodora brought to Byzantine government. Modern historians have developed different approaches to evaluating these conflicting sources. Some accept Procopius's accounts as essentially accurate, viewing Theodora as someone whose early experiences of sexual exploitation shaped her later political behavior in ways that were both understandable and troubling. Others dismiss much of the secret history as unreliable propaganda, focusing instead on the documented legal and political achievements of Theodora's reign. But regardless of which interpretation is more accurate, certain facts about Theodora's career are undisputable. She rose from humble origins to become one of the most powerful rulers in Byzantine history. She implemented major legal and social reforms that provided protections for vulnerable people. She was instrumental in saving Justinian's throne during the Nika Riots. She exercised political authority in ways that had never been seen before in Roman or Byzantine history. Whether the specific details of her alleged sexual exploitation are accurate or exaggerated, the basic trajectory of her life represents one of history's most remarkable transformations. Someone who started with no advantages except intelligence and determination managed to reshape an entire civilization's understanding of power, gender, and social mobility. Theodora's story resonates powerfully with contemporary discussions about leadership, resilience, and social change. In an era when we're still debating how people from disadvantaged backgrounds can access positions of authority, her example provides both inspiration and practical lessons about what becomes possible when talent meets opportunity. Her approach to building and maintaining political power offers insights that remain relevant today. Theodora understood that information was more valuable than money, that personal relationships were political resources, and that sustainable authority required building coalitions of people who benefited from your success, rather than depending on the goodwill of people who controlled your fate. She also demonstrated that backgrounds that might seem to disqualify someone from leadership can actually provide unique advantages. Her experience of poverty, exploitation, and social marginalization gave her insights into human psychology and political dynamics that people born to privilege often lack. Theodora's legal reforms, particularly her work to protect women from sexual exploitation and to provide legal remedies for domestic abuse, established principles that remain central to modern human rights law. Her recognition that legal protections were meaningless without practical enforcement mechanisms anticipated many contemporary debates about how to effectively combat gender-based violence and protect vulnerable populations. Her approach to managing religious and cultural diversity also offers lessons for modern multicultural societies. Instead of requiring complete uniformity of belief and practice, she developed strategies for maintaining political unity while respecting and protecting minority communities. Her example shows that diversity can be a source of strength rather than division if it is managed with intelligence and genuine respect for different perspectives. Perhaps most importantly, Theodora's career illustrates that political transformation is possible, but that it requires both strategic thinking and the willingness to take enormous personal risks. She never forgot where she came from, but she also never accepted that her origins should limit where she could go. Her story challenges us to think more broadly about leadership potential and to recognize that the experiences that seem most damaging might actually prepare people for the kinds of challenges that effective leaders must face. The person who has survived exploitation and abuse may understand power dynamics better than someone who has only experienced power from positions of privilege. The psychological and moral costs of Theodora's transformation from victim to empress were enormous and remain troubling even to observers who admire her achievements. The young woman who had been sexually exploited and humiliated became someone capable of ordering mass executions without apparent emotional distress. The massacre during the Nika riots, regardless of its political necessity, represented a level of violence that exceeded what was required for survival. The scale and systematic nature of the killing revealed someone who had learned to use brutality as a political tool, not just as a last resort for self-defense. Similarly, Theodora's use of intelligence networks and political manipulation, while effective, often involved tactics that violated the privacy and dignity of her enemies in ways that we would today consider unacceptable. She routinely used personal secrets and private vulnerabilities as weapons, destroying people's reputations and lives to protect her own position. These aspects of her career raise uncomfortable questions about what survival in extreme circumstances does to human personality and moral sensitivity. Did her experiences of victimization justify the suffering she later inflicted on others? Or does survival never excuse the perpetuation of cycles of violence and exploitation? There are no easy answers to these questions, but they are questions that Theodora's story forces us to confront. Her life illustrates both the possibility of personal transformation and the moral compromises that such transformation sometimes requires. The woman who emerged from Constantinople's brothels to rule the Byzantine Empire was neither a saint nor a monster, but a complex human being who had learned to use every tool available to protect herself and advance her vision of what society should become. Her methods were sometimes cruel, and her motivations were often self-interested, but her achievements created lasting benefits for people who found themselves in situations similar to what she had experienced. In the end, what makes Theodora's story ultimately compelling is not that she was a perfect person or even a particularly admirable one by modern moral standards. What makes it compelling is that she was undeniably real, undeniably powerful, and undeniably transformative. The sexual horrors that began Theodora's story didn't define its ending. Instead, they became the foundation for one of history's most remarkable demonstrations of how personal transformation can become political revolution, and how individual survival can reshape the destiny of empires. She proved that the human capacity for change and self-determination could overcome even the most terrible circumstances. She demonstrated that intelligence, determination, and strategic thinking could be more powerful than birth, wealth, or social position. She showed that someone who understood power from the perspective of its victims could exercise that power more effectively than people who had never experienced powerlessness. Her enemies called her a whore and a demon, but history remembers her as Empress Theodora, one of the most powerful and influential rulers of the ancient world. That transformation from victim to victor remains one of humanity's most powerful examples of what becomes possible when someone refuses to accept that their circumstances define their limits. The woman who once begged for mercy in the Hippodrome eventually commanded the respect and fear of emperors, generals, and senators. The girl who had been sold and exploited by powerful men grew up to make those same kinds of men tremble at the mention of her name. The actress who had been legally prohibited from marrying into respectable society changed the laws themselves to create new possibilities for social mobility and personal transformation. Theodora's greatest achievement wasn't just surviving the horrors of her early life, remarkable as that was. It wasn't even rising to imperial power, extraordinary as that accomplishment was. Her greatest achievement was proving that human beings have the capacity to transform not just their own lives, but the entire structure of the societies they live in, and that real change is possible, even when it seems completely impossible. In a world where social mobility was almost unheard of, she achieved it completely. In a society where women were expected to be powerless, she became more powerful than most men could dream of being. In a political system designed to maintain existing hierarchies, she forced those hierarchies to change to accommodate someone they had never been designed to include. The Byzantine Empire she helped rule was more just, more prosperous, and more tolerant than it had been before her influence, and it remained more open to social change and gender equality than most societies would be for many centuries after her death. The legal protections she created for vulnerable people lasted for generations, and the precedent she set for female political authority inspired powerful women throughout the medieval world and beyond. Theodora's life was a masterclass in transformation, survival, and the strategic use of power. But it was also a testament to the idea that no one's story is predetermined by their circumstances, and that the worst experiences can sometimes become the foundation for the greatest achievements.